Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Shifting Grounds. From Marcus. The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight when I finally decided to pull into that truck stop outside Bakersfield. My 18-wheeler, a 2019 Peterbilt that had been my home on wheels for the better part of 5 years, was running low on fuel and my eyes were starting to burn from staring through the hypnotic sweep of the wipers. The neon sign flickered lazily in the distance, casting pink and blue reflections across the wet asphalt like some kind of roadside aurora. Desert Oasis Travel Plaza, it read, though there wasn't much desert left this far north, and the oasis part seemed generous given the industrial sprawl that surrounded the place. I'd been hauling electronics from Phoenix to Sacramento, the same route I'd driven dozens of times before, but tonight felt different somehow. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was the way the radio had been cutting in and out for the last 50 miles, picking up fragments of Spanish-language stations and what sounded like old-time gospel music from decades past. The static seemed to follow a rhythm, like breathing, and more than once I'd found myself holding my breath to match it without realizing what I was doing. The truck stop's parking lot stretched out before me like a small city of sleeping giants. Rows upon rows of semi-trucks sat in neat lines, their running lights creating constellations in the darkness. The diesel fumes mixed with the smell of rain on hot pavement, creating that peculiar perfume that every trucker knows by heart. I pulled into what looked like an open spot near the back, away from the main building where the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry insects. The engine's rumble died with a satisfied sigh as I set the parking brake and checked my logbook. 3:30 in the morning, right on schedule for my mandatory rest period. The silence that followed was almost complete, broken only by the gentle patter of rain on my cab roof and the distant hum of refrigerated trailers keeping their cargo cold. I'd planned to grab a quick shower and maybe some coffee before catching a few hours of sleep. But something about the quiet was so peaceful that I found myself reluctant to move. Through my windshield, I could see the other trucks around me, their cabs dark and still, their drivers lost in dreams of home and family and roads that led somewhere other than here. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. The truck parked directly in front of me. A faded red Kenworth with Oklahoma plates seemed to be slightly closer than it had been when I'd parked. Not by much, maybe a foot or two, but enough to make me question my memory. Truckers develop a keen sense of spatial awareness after years on the road, and something felt off about the distance. I rubbed my eyes, attributing the discrepancy to fatigue, and climbed down from my cab to stretch my legs before heading inside. The asphalt beneath my boots felt different than I expected, softer somehow, as if it hadn't fully hardened. Each step left a slight impression, not quite a footprint, but a depression that seemed to fill with water more quickly than physics should have allowed. The rain continued its steady rhythm, creating tiny rivers that flowed between the parked trucks in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like someone had designed a drainage system that existed independent of the lot's actual grade. Inside the travel plaza, everything appeared normal enough. The usual collection of energy drinks and truck stop cuisine sat under harsh fluorescent lighting, while a tired-looking clerk with kind eyes watched a small television behind the counter. A few other drivers sat scattered around the seating area, nursing cups of coffee and staring at their phones with the vacant expression that comes from too many hours of highway hypnosis. The building hummed with the familiar sounds of civilization, air conditioning and refrigeration units, and the distant murmur of CB radio chatter from the driver's lounge. I bought my coffee and a sandwich I didn't particularly want, more for the human interaction than from any real hunger. The clerk, whose name tag read Dolores, smiled as she rang up my purchases, but her eyes kept drifting toward the windows that overlooked the parking lot. When I followed her gaze, I couldn't see anything unusual. Just the same field of trucks sitting patiently in the rain like mechanical cattle. Quiet night, I said, making conversation. They usually are. Around this time, she replied, but her voice carried something I couldn't quite identify. Not fear exactly, but a kind of watchful concern, like someone listening for a sound that might or might not come. You planning to rest here long? Just until dawn, I told her. Got to make Sacramento by noon. She nodded and handed me my change, but her fingers lingered on mine for just a moment longer than necessary. Drive safe, she said, and something in her tone made it sound less like a pleasantry and more like a warning. Back outside, the rain had intensified, turning the parking lot into a mirror that reflected the scattered lights in fractured, dancing patterns. I walked slowly back toward my truck, sipping the coffee and enjoying the cool air after the stale atmosphere of the building. The other trucks around me remained still and dark, their drivers presumably deep in sleep. But as I approached my Peterbilt, I noticed something that made me stop short. The red Kenworth that had been in front of me was now definitely closer, close enough that I could read the small print on the company logo painted on its trailer door. More disturbing still, the truck that had been parked to my left, a blue Freightliner with California plates, was now on my right side, and I was certain it hadn't been there when I'd walked to the building. The spatial relationships of the entire section seemed to have shifted, as if someone had been playing chess with 60-foot game pieces while I was inside. I walked a complete circle around my truck, examining the positioning of every vehicle I could see. The white Volvo with the produce trailer was now 3 spaces closer to the building. The ancient Mack truck with the faded paint job had somehow moved to the opposite side of the row. Even the light poles seemed to be in different positions, casting shadows that fell at angles that didn't match my memory of the lot's layout. Standing there in the rain, with my coffee growing cold in my hands, I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps I'd misremembered where I'd parked. Perhaps the fatigue and the strange weather were affecting my perception more than I'd realized. But deep in my gut, in that place where instincts live and breed, I knew that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. I climbed back into my cab and locked the doors, a precaution I rarely took in truck stops. The interior felt smaller than usual, as if the walls had crept inward while I was gone. Outside my windows, the other trucks continued their silent vigil, but now I found myself studying them with the intensity of a watchman on duty. Every few minutes I thought I could detect movement, subtle adjustments in position that were almost too small to notice, like the hour hand of a clock. The rain drummed steadily on my roof, creating a white noise that should have been soothing but instead felt oppressive, like being trapped inside a giant drum. I tried to distract myself with paperwork, updating my logbook and checking my route for tomorrow. But my eyes kept drifting to the windshield and the gradually shifting landscape beyond. The red Kenworth was definitely closer now, close enough that I could see moisture condensing on its rear door, forming patterns that looked almost like writing in an alphabet I didn't recognize. By 4 a.m, I was certain that the entire parking lot was in motion, a slow-motion dance of multi-ton vehicles that defied every law of physics and logic I'd ever learned. The trucks moved with a purpose that seemed organic rather than mechanical, sliding across the asphalt like pieces of a vast puzzle rearranging itself according to rules I couldn't begin to understand. The light poles swayed despite the absence of wind, and the painted lines on the pavement appeared to be redrawing themselves, creating new patterns that guided the trucks in their mysterious migration. I tried starting my engine, thinking I could simply drive away from whatever was happening here, but the Peterbilt's diesel rumbled to life only to die again immediately, as if something was interfering with the fuel flow. The electrical system flickered, causing my dashboard lights to strobe in patterns that seemed to correspond with the movement of the trucks around me. My CB radio crackled with static that occasionally resolved into fragments of conversation, voices speaking in languages that sounded familiar but used words I'd never heard before. The red Kenworth was now close enough to touch, its trailer door pressing against my windshield with a gentleness that somehow made the contact more terrifying than if it had crashed into me. Through the metal, I could hear a sound like breathing, a rhythmic expansion and contraction that matched the pulsing of the radio static. The other trucks had formed a tight circle around my cab, their trailers creating walls that blocked any view of the building or the highway beyond. The light that never sleeps, from Marcus. The Interstate 70 stretched ahead like a black ribbon through the Colorado mountains, and my Peterbilt's headlights carved twin tunnels through the darkness. It was past 2 in the morning, that dead hour when the world feels emptied out, when even the truck stop diners close their doors and leave only the vending machines humming their electric lullabies. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, pushing the limits of my logbook, but the delivery had to reach Denver by dawn. The coffee had long since worn off, replaced by that hollow alertness that comes from pure stubbornness and the steady rumble of 18 wheels on asphalt. That's when I saw the other truck pulled over at the rest area, a massive Kenworth with a sleeper cab that seemed to glow from within. At first, I thought it was just another driver catching his mandatory rest, maybe watching a movie on his tablet or reading under the dome light. But as I downshifted and pulled into the rest area myself, something about that light bothered me. It was too steady, too bright, and it had an odd quality that reminded me of those old fluorescent bulbs in hospital waiting rooms, the kind that make everything look sickly and wrong. The rest area was otherwise empty except for a family of deer browsing near the tree line, their eyes catching my headlights like green coins before they bounded away into the darkness. I parked my rig 3 spaces down from the Kenworth, close enough to see that the light inside wasn't coming from any normal source I could identify. The sleeper cab's curtains were drawn, but the fabric seemed almost transparent from the intensity of whatever was glowing behind it. I killed my engine and sat in the sudden quiet, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through the pines. Professional courtesy among drivers runs deep, but something kept me from walking over to check on the other trucker. Maybe it was the way that light seemed to pulse slightly, like a slow heartbeat, or maybe it was the complete silence coming from that direction. No generator running, no television chatter, no sound of movement or snoring. Just that strange, steady glow that seemed to grow brighter as my eyes adjusted to the mountain darkness. I climbed into my own sleeper, telling myself I needed the rest more than I needed to satisfy my curiosity. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself aware of that light bleeding through my own curtains, casting everything in my small space with an unsettling blue-white tinge. I tried adjusting my position, facing away from the other truck, but it was like trying to ignore a fire alarm. That light seemed to press against the fabric of my sleeper, insistent and wrong. Around 3:30, I gave up on sleep and made myself a cup of instant coffee on my small electric hot plate. As I waited for the water to heat, I peered through a gap in my curtains at the Kenworth. The light was definitely brighter now, so intense that I could make out details of the truck's interior through the curtains. There was someone in there, a figure sitting upright in what must have been the driver's seat, perfectly still, too still. In all my years on the road, I'd never seen anyone maintain such complete motionlessness, not even in deep sleep. The coffee tasted like metal and regret, but it gave me something to do with my hands while I watched. The figure in the other truck hadn't moved in the 20 minutes I'd been observing. Not so much as a shift in posture or the natural sway of breathing, and that light kept growing stronger, until I had to squint to look directly at the Kenworth sleeper cab. It was beginning to hurt my eyes, like staring at a bare bulb, but I couldn't look away. That's when I noticed my own radio crackling to life, though I'd turned it off hours ago. Static filled the cab, punctuated by what sounded like voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. I reached for the volume knob, but before I could touch it, a voice came through with perfect clarity. It was calling my name, not my CB handle, not driver or big rig, but my actual given name, Marcus, spoken in a tone that was both intimate and utterly alien. The voice wasn't coming from Channel 19, the trucker's frequency, or any frequency I recognized. It seemed to emerge from the static itself, woven through the white noise like thread through fabric. "Marcus," it said again, and this time I could hear something else underneath it, a sound like wind through a vast empty space, or maybe breathing from lungs far larger than any human possessed. I grabbed for the radio's power switch, but my hand froze halfway there as the light from the Kenworth suddenly blazed even brighter, transforming night into a harsh artificial day that washed out the stars and made the surrounding forest look like a black and white photograph. The figure in the other truck's cab had turned toward me, and though I couldn't make out features through the glare, I could feel its attention like a weight pressing against my chest. The radio voice spoke again, clearer now, and I realized with growing horror that it was coming from the direction of the Kenworth. "Been waiting for you, Marcus. Been waiting so long for someone who could see the light properly. Most of them, they just drive on by, but you stopped. You looked. You understood that this isn't just any light, isn't it?" My hand finally found the radio switch and clicked it off, but the voice continued, now seeming to come from everywhere at once, from the very air around me. The light from the other truck was so intense now that I could feel its heat through my windshield, and my sleeper was filled with that cold hospital radiance that made my skin look corpse pale and strange. I started my engine with trembling fingers, not caring about the noise and the pre-dawn quiet, not caring about anything except getting away from that impossible light and the figure that sat so perfectly still within it. But as my Peterbilt rumbled to life, the Kenworth's engine started too, a deep throaty growl that seemed to harmonize with mine in ways that made my teeth ache. The other truck's headlights blazed on, twin suns that turned the rest area into a hellscape of harsh shadows and bleached surfaces. Through my mirrors, I could see that the cab was empty now, no figure sitting in the driver's seat, but the light from the sleeper was so bright it was beginning to burn after images into my vision, even when I looked away. I threw my truck into gear and pulled out onto the interstate, my CB radio crackling back to life despite being switched off, filling with that voice that spoke my name with increasing urgency. "Don't go, Marcus. You're the first one who really saw, the first one who understood. We have so much to show you, so much light to share." The Kenworth followed, staying exactly 3 car lengths behind no matter how fast I pushed my rig. 70 miles per hour, then 80, then 90 as we wound through the mountain passes, my engine screaming in protest while that other truck maintained its perfect distance with an ease that defied physics. The light from its sleeper was visible even in my mirrors, a blazing beacon that seemed to be growing brighter with each passing mile. Other drivers began calling in on the CB, their voices tight with confusion and fear. "What's that light coming up behind me? Jesus, I can't see anything past that glow. Somebody's got their brights on behind me, but they're not headlights, they're something else entirely." Each voice cut off abruptly as the Kenworth passed them, leaving only static and the sound of that vast, inhuman breathing. I took the next exit at nearly 90 miles per hour, tires screaming as I fought to keep 18 wheels on the curved ramp. The Kenworth followed effortlessly, that impossible light now so bright it was turning the pre-dawn sky a sickly blue-white. I could hear my CB radio melting, the plastic housing beginning to warp from some heat that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with that radiance that seemed to burn through the very air. The exit led to a truck stop, one of those 24-hour places that serves as an oasis for drivers crossing the endless highways. I pulled in fast, hoping the presence of other people, other lights, other normal human activity might somehow break whatever was happening. But as I rolled into the parking area, I saw that every other truck was dark and silent, their drivers nowhere to be seen, though the lot was full of rigs that looked like they'd been abandoned in the middle of normal activities. The Kenworth pulled in behind me and stopped, its engine falling silent while that light continued to blaze from the sleeper cab. I sat in my own truck, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles had gone white, watching in my mirrors as something began to move inside that radiance. The Eternal Route, from Marcus Wheeler. The CB radio crackled to life at 3:17 in the morning, cutting through the steady hum of my Peterbilt's engine like a knife through silk. "Wheeler, you copy?" came dispatch's voice. that familiar gravelly tone that had guided me through 1,000 midnight runs across the interstate highways of America. I'd been driving for northbound freight for 8 years, and in all that time I'd never heard another voice come through that radio except his. Never learned his real name either, though I'd asked plenty of times. He just called himself Dispatch, and that was enough. "Copy, Dispatch," I replied, reaching for the handset while keeping my eyes on the rain-slicked asphalt stretching endlessly ahead. The windshield wipers beat a hypnotic rhythm against the autumn storm, their squeaking creating an oddly comforting soundtrack to my solitary journey through the Pennsylvania mountains.
"What's the word?"
"Got another pickup for you, Wheeler. Small freight depot outside of Millerton, about 40 miles southeast of your current position. GPS coordinates coming through now." The radio hissed with static, and I glanced at the small screen mounted on my dashboard as the numbers appeared. I'd been hauling loads for northbound for so long that I rarely questioned the destinations anymore. Dispatch always seemed to know exactly where I was, exactly what I was carrying, and exactly where I needed to go next. But lately, something had been eating at me. A restlessness that started small like a pebble in your boot, but had grown into something I couldn't ignore. 8 years of the same routes, the same late-night pickups, the same endless ribbon of highways stretching toward horizons I never seemed to reach. My wife Sarah had been asking when I'd come home for good, settle down, maybe take that desk job her brother had been offering at his insurance company. The idea was starting to sound less terrible with each passing mile. "Copy that, Dispatch," I said, already adjusting my route. "Listen, I've been meaning to talk to you about something. I'm thinking it might be time for me to hang up the keys, you know? Take some time off, spend it with the family." The silence that followed stretched longer than usual. Even the static seemed to fade, leaving only the engine's steady rumble and the rain drumming against the cab. When Dispatch's voice finally returned, there was something different about it. Colder, maybe, more precise. "We'll discuss that later, Wheeler. Right now, you need to focus on the pickup. Time-sensitive cargo. Can't afford any delays." Something in his tone made me grip the wheel a little tighter. In 8 years, I'd never heard him sound quite like that. But I pushed the feeling aside and guided my rig toward the coordinates he'd provided, watching the GPS guide me off the main interstate and onto increasingly narrow country roads. The rain seemed to be getting heavier, and the streetlights grew fewer and farther between until I was relying solely on my headlights to cut through the darkness. The depot, when I finally found it, looked like it had been abandoned for decades. A single flickering fluorescent light hung over a loading dock that had seen better days, casting sickly yellow shadows across stacks of cargo containers that appeared to be rusting where they stood. I pulled up to the dock and killed the engine, sitting in the sudden silence and wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. My CB crackled again. "You're right on time, Wheeler. Cargo's already loaded and waiting. Just back up to Dock 7 and hook up the trailer that's sitting there." I peered through my rain-streaked windshield and counted the dock numbers painted in faded white numerals along the concrete platform. Sure enough, there was a trailer sitting at Dock 7, though I couldn't make out much detail through the storm. It looked standard enough, maybe a little older than what I usually hauled, but nothing that seemed particularly unusual. "Dispatch, this place looks like it's been closed for years. You sure about this pickup?" "Wheeler, you've been doing this job long enough to know that not all our clients operate during normal business hours. Now hook up that trailer and get back on the road. You've got a delivery to make in Ohio before dawn." The authority in his voice left no room for argument, so I fired up the engine and carefully backed toward the waiting trailer. The connecting process went smoothly enough, though I noticed the trailer seemed heavier than most loads I'd hauled recently. When I climbed out to check the coupling and trailer lights, I caught a glimpse of the manifest tucked into the document pouch. The cargo description simply read miscellaneous freight, with no weight specifications, no client information, and a destination listed as TBD. Back in the cab, I reached for the CB to ask about the vague paperwork, but Dispatch's voice came through before I could key the handset. "Wheeler, We need to talk about what you mentioned earlier. This idea about quitting. The way he said it made my skin crawl. Not angry exactly, but something far more unsettling, like he was discussing the weather or the price of diesel fuel. Look, dispatch, it's nothing personal. I've just been on the road for 8 years straight, barely seeing my family. Sarah's been patient, but I can tell she's getting tired of being married to a ghost who shows up for a weekend every month or two. I'm thinking it's time to come home for good. That's the problem, Wheeler. See, you've been such a reliable driver, so dependable that you've become what we call essential personnel. Can't really afford to let you go right now. Too many routes that need your specific skill set. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn rain. What do you mean, can't afford to let me go? This isn't the military, dispatch. I can quit whenever I want. That's how jobs work. The laugh that came through the radio was somehow worse than if he'd gotten angry. It was the sound of someone who knew something you didn't and wasn't planning to share. Wheeler, when's the last time you remember being home? I mean, really remember, not just think you remember. The question hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to answer, to tell him about last month when I'd spent 3 days at home, helping Sarah plant flowers in the garden and fixing the leaky faucet in the kitchen. But as I tried to recall the specific details, they seemed to slip away like water through my fingers. The flowers had been what color? What room was that faucet in? Had there even been a garden? What kind of question is that? Of course I remember being home. Tell me about your house, Wheeler. What color is it? What street do you live on? What's your wife's maiden name? Each question felt like a punch to the gut. I knew I had a house. I could almost picture it. A nice 2-story place with a front porch and a maple tree in the yard. But the details kept shifting, like trying to hold on to a dream after waking. The color changed from blue to white to yellow every time I tried to focus on it. The street name danced just beyond my mental reach. And Sarah's maiden name? God help me, I couldn't remember Sarah's maiden name. What's happening to me? I whispered into the handset, my voice barely audible over the engine's idle. Nothing's happening to you, Wheeler. You're exactly where you've always been, on the road making deliveries, being the best long-haul driver in our fleet. The problem is you started getting ideas about leaving, about going back to a life that was never really yours to begin with. I stared at the GPS screen, watching the little blue dot that represented my truck sitting motionless at the depot, but something was wrong with the display. The roads around me kept shifting, rearranging themselves like a puzzle being constantly reshuffled. One moment I was in Pennsylvania, the next in Nevada, then somewhere that didn't seem to exist on any map I'd ever seen. How long have I really been driving for you? Time's relative, Wheeler. What matters is the job. You're good at the job. Better than good. You're perfect for it. Never get tired. Never complain about the hours. Never cause problems with the other drivers. Well, you never used to cause problems. I looked down at my hands gripping the steering wheel and noticed something that should have terrified me but somehow didn't. My hands looked exactly the same as they had 8 years ago when I'd first started driving for northbound. No new scars, no additional wear, no signs of aging. The wedding ring on my finger gleamed like it had just been polished, showing no signs of the daily wear that should have accumulated over nearly a decade of use. The other drivers, I said slowly. I don't think I've ever actually met any of the other drivers. You keep to yourself. That's one of the things we appreciate about you. The mile that festers, from Marcus Delacroix. The smell hit me first around mile marker 187 on Route 34, that long stretch of Louisiana blacktop that cuts through the bayou country like a scar across forgotten flesh. I'd been driving 18-wheelers for the better part of 20 years, hauling everything from auto parts to frozen chicken, and I thought I'd smelled it all. The sickly sweet stench of spoiled meat from a broken refrigeration unit, the acrid burn of overheated brakes, even the unfortunate aftermath of roadkill baking in the summer sun. But this was different. This was the smell of something that had been rotting for far longer than nature ever intended. I rolled down the windows of my Peterbilt 379, hoping the humid night air might clear it out, but that only made it worse. The stench seemed to seep through the cab like fog, thick and cloying, coating the back of my throat with each breath. My CB radio crackled with static, the usual chatter of night drivers replaced by an unsettling silence that stretched across all 19 channels. The dashboard clock glowed a pale green 2:47 a.m., and my headlights carved twin tunnels through the darkness ahead, illuminating Spanish moss that hung from ancient cypress trees like tattered burial shrouds. The load I was carrying wasn't anything special, just a trailer full of office furniture bound for Baton Rouge. But the delivery schedule had me running behind, and Route 34 was the quickest way to make up time. During the day, this stretch of highway buzzed with moderate traffic, but after midnight it became a different creature entirely, lonely and primeval, where the boundary between the civilized world and something far older grew thin as morning mist. The smell intensified as I passed mile marker 188, and I found myself breathing through my mouth, trying to filter the air through gritted teeth. It reminded me of that time I discovered a dead possum that had somehow gotten trapped in my garage during a particularly wet spring. I'd only found it after 3 weeks when the smell had become so overwhelming that even my neighbors started complaining. But this was worse. Deeper somehow, as if the very asphalt beneath my wheels was infected with decay. My engine hummed its familiar rumble, the sound that had become as comforting as a heartbeat over the years. But even that seemed muffled now, dampened by the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over this stretch of road like a wool blanket soaked in swamp water. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, plenty to get me past this godforsaken section and back to civilization, where truck stops glowed like beacons and coffee was always hot. No matter the hour, mile marker 189 drifted past, and I noticed something odd in my peripheral vision. The trees on either side of the road, those massive cypress and tupelo that had stood sentinel here since before the first European settlers arrived, appeared to be leaning inward, their branches reaching across the asphalt like gnarled fingers trying to touch. It was probably just a trick of the headlights and my tired eyes, but the effect was unsettling enough that I sat up straighter in my seat and adjusted my grip on the steering wheel. The CB radio suddenly burst to life with a scratchy voice that sounded like it was broadcasting from the bottom of a well. Any drivers on Route 34, y'all be careful through that stretch past the old Boudreaux place. Something ain't right out there tonight. The transmission cut off before I could respond, leaving only static and the steady drone of my diesel engine. I tried to raise the other driver on channel 19, but got nothing back except electronic whispers that might have been voices or might have just been interference from the power lines that followed the highway like a mechanical spine. At mile marker 190, I saw the first sign of whatever had died along this route. In the beam of my headlights, something large and dark lay crumpled in the grass beside the road. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of matted fur and exposed ribs, but it was gone too quickly to identify. Could have been a deer or maybe a wild pig, though the smell suggested it had been decomposing for weeks. But that didn't make sense either. The State Highway Department was usually pretty good about clearing roadkill, especially on a route this traveled. The stench grew stronger still, and I found myself wondering if there might be some kind of industrial accident nearby, maybe a chemical spill or a sewage treatment problem. But this stretch of Route 34 ran through nothing but wetlands and forest, with the nearest industrial facility at least 30 miles north. The smell had an organic quality that spoke of natural decay rather than chemical contamination. The kind of rot that happens when life surrenders to death and time is given free rein to work its inevitable magic. My headlights swept across mile marker 191, and that's when I saw the house. It sat maybe 50 yards back from the road, connected by a gravel driveway that disappeared into tall grass and weeds. The structure looked like it had once been a modest Creole cottage, the kind that dotted this part of Louisiana like memories of a more prosperous time. But now it sagged under the weight of neglect. Its tin roof buckled and stained with rust, its windows dark as empty eye sockets. A porch that had probably once welcomed visitors now leaned at a dangerous angle, supported by makeshift posts that looked ready to give way at any moment. What caught my attention, though, wasn't the house itself but the yard around it. Even in the limited illumination from my headlights, I could see that the grass was wrong, yellowed and withered in patches that formed no discernible pattern. And scattered across the property like some macabre lawn ornament display were more dark shapes, more carcasses in various stages of decomposition. Some looked fresh, others reduced to little more than bones and sinew, all of them contributing to the overwhelming stench that had been building since mile marker 187. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I'd developed in 20 years of cross-country hauling told me to keep my foot on the accelerator and put this place in my mirrors as quickly as possible. But something about the scene nagged at me, a sense that this wasn't just random death but something deliberately arranged. The way the carcasses were positioned seemed almost ritualistic, forming rough circles around the property like some kind of primitive boundary marker. The CB radio crackled again, and this time I heard what sounded like my own voice saying, "Marcus, you need to stop. You need to go up to that house and see what's happening." But that was impossible. I hadn't keyed the microphone, hadn't spoken a word since trying to raise that other driver 15 minutes ago. I reached for the radio to check the channel, and that's when my engine started to sputter. The Peterbilt's diesel had been running smooth as silk for the past 100,000 miles, recently serviced and tuned to perfection. But now it coughed and wheezed like an old man with pneumonia, the RPMs dropping despite my foot steady on the accelerator. I worked the throttle, trying to coax more power from the engine, but it responded with a series of mechanical groans that I'd never heard before. The temperature gauge remained normal, oil pressure steady, but something was definitely wrong. The truck began to slow and I guided it toward the shoulder, hoping I could nurse it past this cursed stretch of highway before it died completely. But as I drew even with the driveway to the ruined house, the engine gave one final shudder and fell silent. The sudden quiet was deafening after hours of constant diesel rumble, filled only by the settling sounds of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through the cypress trees. I tried the ignition, pumping the accelerator and engaging the starter, but got nothing except the mechanical clicking of a system that refused to cooperate. The fuel gauge still showed 3/4 full. The electrical systems were functioning normally, but my truck sat dead on the shoulder of Route 34 like a beached whale, 50 yards from a house that radiated wrongness like heat from a furnace. The smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming in its intensity, and I found myself gagging despite my best efforts to breathe shallow. I reached for my cell phone to call for roadside assistance, but the screen showed no signal, not even the single bar I usually got in remote areas. The CB radio offered nothing but static when I tried to raise help, as if this stretch of highway existed in some kind of communication dead zone. That's when I noticed movement in the darkness around the house. At first I thought it might be more animals, maybe scavengers drawn by the scent of decay, but the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful. Shapes shifted between the carcasses, tall and angular, moving with a fluid grace that suggested intelligence rather than instinct. I couldn't make out details in the darkness beyond my headlights, but there were definitely multiple figures, and they seemed to be working together in some kind of coordinated effort. The Sleep of Stillwater, from Marcus. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of an hour when I first saw the sign for Stillwater, population 8247, emerging from the Oregon fog like a ghost materializing in my headlights. It was well past midnight, and my Peterbilt's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I downshifted, feeling the satisfying compression brake slow my 40-foot trailer, loaded with electronics bound for Portland. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, but somehow I'd never noticed this particular exit before, though that wasn't entirely unusual in this part of the state where small towns seem to appear and disappear like mirages. Between the towering Douglas firs, the fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty. And my logbook told me I was pushing the limits of my driving hours. Federal regulations demanded I rest, and my body agreed, that familiar ache settling into my shoulders and lower back. The exit ramp curved gently downward, flanked by tall grass that whispered against the wind, bending and swaying in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic in the peripheral glow of my running lights. As I descended toward what I assumed would be a typical small town, complete with a truck stop or at least a gas station, I noticed how absolutely still everything appeared to be. The first few buildings I passed were residential, modest homes with small front yards and picket fences, the kind of wholesome Americana that made you think of apple pie and Friday night football games. But something felt off in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Every house was dark, not just the darkness of people sleeping, but the complete absence of any light whatsoever. No porch lights, no street lamps, no blue flicker of television sets bleeding through curtains. Even the traffic lights I encountered hung motionless, their colored lenses black and lifeless, though somehow I knew instinctively when to treat them as four-way stops. My engine's rumble seemed impossibly loud in the silence, each gear change echoing off the buildings like thunder in a canyon. I rolled down my window hoping to hear something, anything that would indicate life in this place. But the only sound was the soft whisper of my tires on asphalt, and the distant hum of my refrigeration unit cycling on and off. Even the air felt different here, thicker somehow, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and something else I couldn't identify. Something that reminded me of the way hospitals smell after visiting hours when all the families have gone home. I found what appeared to be the town's main commercial district, a strip of small businesses lining both sides of a street that couldn't have been more than 4 blocks long. A diner called Mabel's sat on one corner, its neon sign dark but somehow still managing to cast what I could have sworn was a faint pink glow on the sidewalk beneath it. Next to it stood a barbershop with one of those old-fashioned spiral poles, frozen mid-rotation, and beyond that a small grocery store with hand-painted signs in the windows advertising sales on items I hadn't seen in years. I pulled my rig into the parking lot of what looked like it might have been a truck stop, though it was smaller than most, with only 4 diesel pumps and a building that seemed to serve as both convenience store and restaurant. The lot was completely empty except for my truck, and as I set the air brakes with their characteristic hiss, the silence that followed felt almost oppressive. I sat there for several minutes, engine idling, studying the building through my windshield. The large windows were dark, but I could make out shapes inside. What looked like shelves stocked with merchandise, tables and chairs arranged as if waiting for the morning rush. The fuel pumps were old but appeared functional, though when I climbed down from my cab and approached the nearest one, I discovered there was no way to pay. No credit card reader, no instructions to pay inside, just an analog display that read 0. I tried lifting the handle anyway, more out of curiosity than hope, and to my surprise, diesel began flowing freely. The numbers on the pump rolled by slowly, and I found myself mesmerized by their steady progression, the only movement in this tableau of stillness. While my tanks filled, I walked to the store's front door and pressed my face against the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to peer inside. The interior looked perfectly normal, shelves lined with snacks and drinks, a coffee station near the register, even a small restaurant area with vinyl booths and a counter. Everything appeared clean and well-maintained, as if someone had just finished closing up for the night. Except there were no closed signs, no indication of business hours, no evidence that anyone had been here at all. I returned to my truck and finished fueling, then drove slowly through the residential areas, hoping to find some sign of life. The houses were all variations on the same theme, well-maintained but eerily vacant, with perfectly manicured lawns and flower boxes that somehow seemed to be thriving, despite the apparent absence of anyone to tend them. I passed a school, its playground equipment still and silent, swings hanging motionless in the thick air. A small park occupied the town center, complete with a gazebo and benches arranged around a fountain that I realized was still running. Its gentle splashing, the first sound I'd heard that wasn't generated by my own truck. The courthouse sat at the far end of the park, a stately brick building with white columns and a clock tower that showed the correct time, though I was certain I hadn't heard it chime. I parked across the street and sat in my cab, studying the building and trying to make sense of what I was experiencing. Logic told me this was simply a very quiet town in the middle of the night, that the residents were all asleep in their beds, that the apparent absence of electrical power was probably due to some routine maintenance or a minor outage that would be resolved by morning. But as I sat there, I began to notice details that undermined these rational explanations. The grass in the park was too perfect, every blade the same height as if it had been trimmed with scissors rather than mowed. The flowers in the courthouse planters were blooming in combinations that shouldn't have been possible. Spring tulips growing alongside autumn chrysanthemums. Most disturbing of all, I realized that I hadn't seen a single car, either parked in driveways or on the streets, as if the entire population of Stillwater had simply vanished, leaving behind a town maintained by invisible hands. I reached for my CB radio, hoping to raise another driver who might be familiar with this area, but the static that had been my companion for hours had been replaced by something else. A low humming sound that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I adjusted the squelch and tried different channels, but the humming persisted, growing slightly louder each time I changed frequencies. It was a soothing sound, almost musical, and I found myself becoming drowsy as I listened to it. That's when I noticed the people in the windows. They appeared gradually, like photographs developing in a dark room. Faces pressed against glass in houses I had assumed were empty. Men, women, children, all perfectly still, all watching my truck with expressions I couldn't read in the dim light. They didn't wave or show any sign of acknowledgement when I climbed down from my cab and walked closer to get a better look. They simply stood there, motionless as mannequins, their eyes following my movement with the mechanical precision of security cameras. I approached the nearest house, a blue colonial with white trim and a rose garden that bloomed in impossible profusion. A woman stood at the front window, middle-aged with graying hair and wearing what appeared to be a floral house dress. Her face was pleasant enough, the kind of maternal figure you'd expect to find baking cookies or tending to scraped knees, but her absolute stillness was deeply unsettling. I waved, called out a greeting, even knocked on the glass, but she remained frozen, her gaze fixed on some point just over my left shoulder. I moved to the next house and found a similar scene. An elderly man in suspenders and a white shirt standing at his living room window, as motionless as a museum exhibit. House after house revealed the same tableau. Entire families arranged at their windows like displays in some cosmic shop window, all of them watching, all of them perfectly, impossibly still. Children held toys that would never move. Adults stood in conversational poses that would never be completed, all of them caught in a moment that seemed to stretch toward eternity. The humming from my CB radio was growing louder, and I realized it was coming from the town itself, emanating from the very air around me. It was the sound of sleep, I understood with sudden clarity, the collective exhale of a community lost in dreams so deep that waking had become impossible. These people weren't dead. They were trapped in slumber, standing vigil at their windows in some sort of somnambulistic state that defied everything I thought I knew about the world. I hurried back to my truck, suddenly desperate to leave this place, but when I turned the key, my engine coughed and wheezed before falling silent. The exit that goes nowhere. From Marcus. The rain started just past midnight, drumming against the windshield of my Peterbilt with that familiar rhythm that usually helps me stay focused on long hauls. I'd been driving for Consolidated Freight for 15 years, and I knew every major route through the Midwest like the back of my weathered hands. Tonight was supposed to be simple, a load of automotive parts from Detroit to Kansas City, nothing I hadn't done 100 times before. The CB radio crackled occasionally with the voices of other drivers fighting off sleep, but mostly it was just me. The steady hum of the diesel engine and the hypnotic sweep of the wipers clearing away the steady drizzle. I was making good time on Interstate 70, cruising through the rolling hills of Missouri, when I noticed my fuel gauge creeping toward the red. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed green in the darkness, reading 2:37 in the morning. I'd been pushing it, trying to make up time after that delay at the loading dock, but now I needed to find a truck stop. The next major exit wasn't for another 40 miles according to my GPS, but I remembered there being a smaller station somewhere along this stretch. One of those independent places that stayed open all night for drivers like me. The neon sign appeared through the rain like a beacon, though something seemed off about the colors. Instead of the usual bright whites and blues of a typical truck stop, this sign flickered between pale yellow and sickly green, casting an unsettling glow across the wet pavement. The letters spelled out "Last Chance Fuel" in script that looked hand-painted, and below it, a smaller sign read, "Exit 247B, Diesel 24/7. I didn't remember seeing this particular station before, but after 15 years of night driving, sometimes these smaller stops blended together in my memory. The exit ramp curved down and to the right, winding through a grove of tall pine trees that seemed to lean inward over the road like they were trying to block out the sky. My headlights cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating the wet asphalt and the occasional reflector post. But something felt different about this exit ramp. It seemed longer than most, curving more than necessary for a simple off-ramp. I downshifted and let the engine brake do most of the work as I navigated the gentle curves, expecting to see the truck stop's main building any moment. But the curve just kept going. And going. I checked my speedometer and realized I'd been on this exit ramp for almost 2 full minutes, descending at a steady grade through the pine forest. My CB radio had gone completely silent, not even the usual static that accompanied weak signals. The only sounds were my engine's steady rumble and the rain pattering against the cab. I should have reached the bottom of the ramp by now, should have seen fuel pumps or a parking area, or at least another road, but there was nothing ahead except more wet asphalt disappearing into my headlight beams. The trees began to thin out, and I could see that the ramp was finally straightening, leading toward what looked like a small cluster of buildings ahead. The neon sign from the interstate was nowhere to be seen now, but I could make out the faint glow of lights through the rain. As I drew closer, I realized the buildings looked older than I'd expected, with architectural styles that seemed decades out of date. The main structure was a low rectangular building with large windows that glowed with warm yellow light, and next to it stood a couple of fuel islands under a metal canopy. I pulled up to the diesel pump and set my air brakes with a hiss that seemed unusually loud in the quiet night. The fuel island was well lit but empty, and I could see through the windows of the main building that there were people inside, though they moved slowly, almost languidly, like they were walking through water. A bell chimed somewhere as I climbed down from the cab, and the sound echoed strangely, lasting longer than it should have in the open air. The fuel pump looked standard enough, though the numbers on the display seemed to flicker occasionally, showing prices that didn't quite make sense. I inserted my company credit card and began fueling, listening to the familiar sound of diesel flowing through the nozzle. That's when I noticed something odd about the prices cycling through on the LED display. They weren't just fluctuating with normal price changes. They were showing numbers from different decades. For a moment, the display read 97 cents per gallon, then jumped to $4.38, then back to $1.15. While the tank filled, I walked toward the building to grab a coffee and maybe ask about the strange exit ramp. The parking lot felt different under my boots, softer somehow, like the asphalt hadn't fully cured. Inside, the truck stop had the typical layout of a convenience store combined with a small restaurant area. But everything looked like it was from 20 or 30 years ago. The merchandise on the shelves showed brands and packaging I remembered from when I first started driving, and the coffee station featured one of those old percolator systems instead of the modern drip machines most places used now. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with graying hair and a name tag that read, Earl. He looked up at me with a pleasant smile, but his eyes seemed to focus on something just over my left shoulder, instead of meeting my gaze directly. His movements were deliberate and slow, like he was concentrating very hard on each simple task. "Evening, driver," Earl said, his voice carrying a slight echo that didn't match the acoustics of the small building. "Hope you're finding everything you need. Don't get many visitors on nights like this." I nodded and poured myself a cup of coffee from the percolator. The liquid was darker than I expected and gave off an aroma that was simultaneously familiar and completely foreign, like coffee mixed with something floral and slightly metallic. "Strange exit ramp you've got here," I mentioned casually. "Seemed longer than most." Earl's smile didn't change, but he tilted his head slightly, as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Oh, that old thing. Sometimes these mountain roads play tricks on you, especially at night. Time gets a bit stretchy up here. Coffee's on the house for professional drivers." I thanked him and walked back outside, sipping the coffee and immediately regretting it. The taste was wrong. Not bitter or burnt like bad truck stop coffee usually was, but sweet in a way that made my teeth ache and left an aftertaste like copper pennies. The fuel pump had finished, and I replaced the nozzle and grabbed my receipt, noting that the timestamp showed a date 3 days in the future. Back in my cab, I started the engine and looked for signs pointing back to the interstate. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were no signs. No Interstate 70 east-west markers, no road indicators, nothing to suggest how to get back to the main highway. The only road leading away from the truck stop was a narrow 2-lane strip of asphalt that curved back into the pine forest, and there was absolutely no indication of where it led. I shifted into gear and followed the road, assuming it would curve back around and connect to an on-ramp that would take me back to Interstate 70. My GPS had stopped working entirely, showing only a blank screen with a message that read, "Signal not available, location unknown." The CB radio remained silent except for an occasional burst of what sounded like music from decades past, big band sounds that faded in and out like distant radio stations. The road wound through the forest for what felt like miles, climbing gradually and curving back and forth through the tall pines. My headlights revealed the same monotonous scenery: wet asphalt, reflector posts, and endless trees pressing close to the road. I began to feel a growing anxiety as I realized I should have reached some kind of intersection or on-ramp by now. This couldn't possibly be the way back to the interstate. Then I saw lights ahead through the trees, and my heart sank as I recognized the familiar sickly green and yellow glow. The neon sign reading "Last Chance Fuel" flickered into view as the road curved to the right, leading me back down toward the same cluster of buildings I'd just left. But that was impossible. I'd been driving away from the truck stop for at least 20 minutes, following what seemed like a completely different road. I pulled over and sat there with the engine idling, trying to make sense of what was happening. The fuel gauge showed that I'd definitely gotten diesel. The tank was full just like it should be, but somehow the road had led me in a complete circle back to the same place. I grabbed my road atlas from behind the seat and tried to find any reference to exit 247B. But according to the detailed maps, there was no such exit on this section of Interstate 70. Determined to find the right way out, I drove past the truck stop without stopping and continued following the road. Maybe I'd just gotten confused in the darkness and rain. Mile marker 237 from Jake Morrison. The thing about driving long haul is that you notice details other folks miss. After 23 years behind the wheel of my Peterbilt, I can tell you which rest stops have the cleanest bathrooms, which way stations run late, and exactly how many miles it takes for that persistent rattle in the cab to drive you half crazy. But what I noticed most on that foggy October night wasn't the usual wear and tear of highway life. It was the teeth marks. I was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit down to Atlanta, running my usual route along Interstate 75. The fog had rolled in thick around midnight, the kind that makes your headlights feel like they're pushing through cotton. My CB crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers. warnings about speed traps and weather conditions. But even that friendly noise seemed muffled by the oppressive gray wall surrounding my truck. The heater hummed steadily, fighting off the October chill that tried to seep through the windows, and my coffee had gone cold hours ago in the cup holder beside me. That's when I spotted mile marker 237, barely visible through the soup-thick fog that had turned the interstate into a tunnel of uncertainty. Something about it caught my eye, made me tap the brakes just slightly. The marker looked different somehow, though I'd passed this exact spot hundreds of times over the years. In the sweep of my headlights, the reflective numbers seemed dimmer than they should be, and there was something dark staining the white surface of the sign. I probably should have kept driving. Schedule was tight and I had a delivery deadline to meet, but curiosity has always been my weakness, and after 2 decades of seeing the same mile markers, the same highway signs, the same monotonous stretch of asphalt, anything unusual tends to grab your attention. I eased the big rig onto the shoulder, hazard lights blinking amber against the fog, and grabbed my flashlight from the door compartment. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked back toward the marker, flashlight beam cutting through the mist like a sword through silk. The fog seemed to muffle everything, even the distant sound of traffic, until it felt like I was walking through a gray, soundless world. When I reached the mile marker, I had to blink twice to make sure I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. Teeth marks, deep curved impressions carved into the metal post of the sign, running from about waist height all the way down to the ground. They were too big to be from a dog, too numerous to be from any normal animal I could think of. The metal looked scraped and gouged, as if something had been gnawing on the post with desperate hunger. Dark stains, which I'd initially mistaken for rust or weather damage, were concentrated around the deepest marks. I ran my fingers along the gouges, feeling the sharp edges where metal had been scraped away. The marks were fresh, not weathered like they would be if they'd been there for months or years. Some of them were deep enough that I could fit my fingertip inside the groove. Whatever had made these marks had powerful jaws and the patience to work at the metal for a considerable amount of time. A chill that had nothing to do with the October. Air ran down my spine as I noticed something else. The ground around the base of the mile marker was torn up, churned like something large had been pacing or thrashing around the sign. In the soft earth, barely visible in my flashlight beam, were impressions that might have been footprints, though they were unlike any I'd ever seen. They were roughly human-sized but elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the front of each print. The fog seemed to be growing thicker, pressing in around me like a living thing. My truck's hazard lights blinked rhythmically behind me, reassuring beacons in the gray void. But they seemed farther away than they should be. I'd only walked maybe 30 yards back to the mile marker, but the distance felt vast now, as if the fog had stretched the space between me and safety. That's when I heard the breathing. It started as barely more than a whisper, a soft huffing sound that I initially dismissed as wind moving through the fog. But wind doesn't have rhythm, doesn't have the deliberate, measured cadence of lungs filling and emptying. The sound was coming from somewhere beyond the range of my flashlight, out in the gray nothingness that surrounded the highway. I swept the beam back and forth trying to locate the source, but the light seemed to be absorbed by the fog just a few feet from where I stood. The breathing grew closer, more distinct. It had a wet quality to it, like someone with a bad chest cold, and underneath that was something else. A low rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my feet. Whatever was making that sound was big, much bigger than the footprints around the mile marker had suggested. I started backing toward my truck, keeping the flashlight beam moving in slow arcs in front of me. The breathing followed, maintaining the same distance as if whatever was out there was pacing me step for step. My boots crunched on the gravel shoulder, each footstep seeming unnaturally loud in the fog-muffled world. Behind me, my truck's diesel engine idled with its familiar rumble, a comforting mechanical heartbeat in the silence. Then I saw the eyes. They appeared first as 2 pale spots in the fog, catching my flashlight beam and reflecting it back like a cat's eyes, but larger, much larger. They were positioned high enough that whatever they belonged to had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. As I watched, frozen with a mixture of fascination and terror, the eyes moved, tracking my movement with predatory intelligence. The breathing became more labored, more excited, and I could hear other sounds now. The soft pad of footsteps on wet grass, the rustle of undergrowth being pushed aside, and underneath it all, that same wet, rumbling sound I'd heard before. But now I realized what it was. It was the sound of something large and hungry, and it was salivating. I broke into a run, abandoning all pretense of calm investigation. My boot slipped on the wet gravel as I sprinted toward my truck, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind me, the breathing became a ragged panting, and I could hear heavy footsteps pursuing me, no longer attempting stealth. Whatever had been watching me from the fog had decided the time for hiding was over. My truck looked like salvation, all chrome and steel and comforting familiarity. I yanked open the driver's door and hauled myself up into the cab, hands shaking as I reached for the gear shift. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the fog behind me. A dark shape that seemed too large and moved in ways that hurt to look at directly. I dropped the transmission into drive and pressed the accelerator, feeling the big diesel engine respond with a satisfying surge of power. The truck pulled away from the shoulder and back onto the interstate, hazard lights still blinking. In my mirrors, the fog swirled and eddied in the wake of my passage, but I couldn't see anything following me. For the next 100 miles, I drove with my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to leave marks, checking my mirrors every few seconds. The fog gradually began to thin, revealing familiar stretches of highway, normal mile markers that showed no signs of teeth marks or claw gouges. My heart rate slowly returned to normal, and I began to convince myself that perhaps I'd let my imagination run away with me. 23 years of night driving can play tricks on a man's mind, especially when fatigue and isolation start to set in. But 3 weeks later, I was contacted by a state highway inspector who'd heard I'd reported some vandalism to a mile marker on Interstate 75. He wanted to know if I'd seen anything unusual that night, because they'd found similar damage to mile markers 238, 239, and 240. All of them showed the same pattern of teeth marks, the same gouged metal, the same churned earth around their bases, and each damaged marker was exactly 1 mile closer to Atlanta than the last. I still drive that route regularly, though I make sure to time my runs so I pass through that section during daylight hours. The damaged mile markers have been replaced, bright and new and unmarked. But sometimes when the fog rolls in thick and the CB radio goes quiet, I find myself checking the mile markers more carefully than I used to, because I know that somewhere out there in the fog, something is still hungry, still following the highway south, 1 mile marker at a time. The voice inside the static, from Marcus Holloway. The CB radio had been crackling with the same old chatter for 3 hours straight as I pushed my Peterbilt through the endless stretch of Nebraska farmland. Channel 19 was alive with the usual suspects. Drivers complaining about dot checkpoints, weather reports passed from rig to rig, and the occasional lonely soul just looking for someone to talk to through the long prairie night. I'd been running this route for 15 years, hauling electronics from Omaha to Denver, and the familiar voices had become like old friends scattered across the highways, their call signs and stories weaving together into the soundtrack of my nocturnal world. The dashboard clock glowed a soft green as it rolled past 2 in the morning, and the hypnotic rhythm of the diesel engine beneath me had settled into that comfortable purr that could lull a man to sleep if he wasn't careful. Rain had started to fall about an hour back. Not the violent thunderstorm kind that makes driving treacherous, but the gentle, persistent drizzle that turns the world into a watercolor painting seen through the windshield. My wipers swept back and forth in their steady cadence, and the neon signs of the few truck stops and diners along this stretch created blurred streaks of red and blue light against the wet glass. I was thinking about Sarah, my ex-wife. wondering if she was still living in that little house in Tucson with the cactus garden she'd spent so many weekends tending. We'd divorced 3 years ago, not out of anger or betrayal, just the slow realization that my life on the road and her need for stability were two forces pulling in opposite directions. I found myself wondering if she ever thought about those Sunday mornings when I'd be home for a few days between runs. How we'd sit on the back porch with our coffee and watch the desert sunrise paint the mountains in shades of orange and gold. That's when the CB crackled to life with a voice I didn't recognize, clear as crystal despite the rain and the distance. "Sounds like you miss her something fierce, driver." I nearly swerved into the median. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I glanced at the CB radio mounted above my head, its red channel indicator still showing 19. Nobody had been talking on the radio for at least 10 minutes, and I certainly hadn't keyed the microphone to share my private thoughts with anyone. The voice had been calm, almost gentle, with the kind of worn-down quality that comes from years of cigarettes and highway exhaust. But there was something else underneath it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I reached for the handset, my thumb hovering over the talk button as I tried to make sense of what I'd just heard. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe some other driver out there was dealing with his own relationship troubles and I'd just projected my own situation onto his words. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the cab, and somewhere in the distance, I could see the faint glow of another truck's taillights disappearing over a hill. Breaker 19. "This is Midnight Runner," I finally said, using the handle I'd carried for over a decade. Did somebody just call me out? Static filled the airwaves for a long moment, then that same voice came back clearer than before. "You were thinking about that cactus garden, weren't you? How she'd water those prickly pears every evening while you sat on the porch swing, wishing you could stay but knowing you'd be gone again by Tuesday morning." The coffee mug in my cup holder began to rattle as my hands started to shake. I'd never told anyone about the cactus garden, not even my closest friends. Sarah had been so proud of that little desert oasis she'd created, and the image of her kneeling among those thorny sentinels with her gardening gloves and that old metal watering can was something I'd kept locked away in the most private corners of my memory. The voice on the radio had described it perfectly, down to the porch swing I'd installed the summer before we separated, thinking maybe if I gave her something to remember me by during my long absences, it might help bridge the growing distance between us. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely steady as I keyed the microphone. "What's your 20? The response came immediately, as if the mysterious voice had been waiting for my question. "I'm right here with you, Marcus. Been riding along since you crossed the state line back at Council Bluffs. You've been thinking so loud I couldn't help but listen." I checked my mirrors frantically, scanning the dark highway behind me for any sign of another vehicle. The road stretched empty in both directions. Nothing but wet asphalt reflecting the occasional streetlight and the distant glow of farmhouse windows scattered across the rolling landscape. My CB was definitely tuned to channel 19, and I could hear the faint murmur of other drivers in the background, their conversations distant and normal. But this voice, this impossible voice that somehow knew my thoughts, cut through the static like it was broadcasting from inside my own skull. "Now you're wondering if you're losing your mind," the voice continued, and I could hear what might have been amusement in its tone. "Thinking maybe you've been on the road too long? Maybe all those energy drinks and caffeine pills are finally catching up with you. But you know that's not it, don't you, Marcus? You can feel something else riding along in your cab tonight. Something that's been waiting for just the right frequency to tune in." The cab of my Peterbilt suddenly felt smaller, the familiar space that had been my mobile home for thousands of miles now seeming cramped and claustrophobic. I reached over and cranked the air conditioning higher, though the night outside was cool and damp. My shirt was starting to stick to my back with perspiration, and the comforting rumble of the diesel engine now sounded ominous, like some great mechanical heartbeat counting down to something I couldn't name. I tried changing channels, spinning the dial through the various CB frequencies, but the voice followed me to every station. On channel 17, it asked me about the night terrors I'd been having lately. Dreams where I was driving through endless tunnels that grew narrower with each mile. On Channel 12, it mentioned the letter I'd written to Sarah 3 weeks ago but never sent. The one where I'd tried to explain how the loneliness of the road had changed me, made me into someone I didn't recognize anymore. On Channel 6, it whispered about the close call I'd had near Flagstaff last month, when I dozed off for just a second and woken up to find my rig drifting toward the guardrail. "You see, Marcus," the voice said as I desperately spun back to Channel 19, "some of us never really leave the highway. We just keep broadcasting, looking for someone who's tuned to the right frequency, someone whose thoughts are clear enough to pick up our signal. You've been transmitting your loneliness for months now, sending it out over the airwaves whether you knew it or not. And tonight finally someone heard you calling." The rain was coming down harder now and I had to slow the truck as visibility decreased. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness ahead, illuminating the reflective lane markers and the occasional road sign that emerged from the gloom like a ghost materializing from the ether. I passed a sign indicating that the next town was still 30 miles away, and the thought of being alone on this empty stretch of highway with whatever was speaking to me through the radio made my stomach clench with anxiety. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper into the microphone. "Just company," the voice replied, and now it sounded sad, infinitely tired. Been so long since someone could hear me clearly. Most drivers, their minds are full of static, too much noise to get through. But you, Marcus, you've been broadcasting on a clear channel for months. All that regret, all that longing for something you can't quite name. It creates a perfect signal, clean and strong and easy to lock onto. I realized I was crying, tears streaming down my cheeks as the voice spoke truths I'd never admitted to myself. The loneliness wasn't just about Sarah, wasn't just about the failed marriage or the empty apartment I barely visited between runs. It was something deeper, a fundamental disconnection that had been growing inside me for years, fed by countless miles of solitary driving, and reinforced by the artificial intimacy of CB conversations with strangers I'd never meet face to face. "The thing is," the voice continued, "once someone like me finds a good signal, we don't like to let it go. We've been waiting so long for someone who can really hear us, someone whose thoughts are strong enough to carry our words. You and me, Marcus, we could keep each other company for a very long time. All those lonely nights ahead, all those empty miles, you'd never have to drive them alone again." The mirror that loved me back, from Marcus. The thing about driving long haul is that you spend so much time alone with your thoughts that eventually you start talking to yourself. And after a while, you start talking to your truck. My Peterbilt and I had been partners for 7 years when this happened, rolling across the interstate arteries of America like blood through veins, carrying freight and stories in the weight of miles, between small towns that most people only see from airplane windows. It was somewhere in the stretched darkness between Amarillo and Oklahoma City when I first noticed something strange about my rearview mirror. The night was clear and cold, with that particular kind of silence that comes when you're the only set of headlights on a long stretch of highway. My CB radio crackled occasionally with distant trucker chatter, voices floating through the static like ghosts, but mostly it was just me and the steady rumble of 18 wheels on asphalt, the familiar vibration of the engine humming through the cab. I'd been fighting fatigue for the last hour, that dangerous drowsiness that creeps up on drivers when the white lines start hypnotizing you and your eyelids feel heavy as lead. Coffee only goes so far, and I'd already had 3 cups from the last truck stop. Bitter gas station brew that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since the Carter administration. I was checking my mirrors regularly, part of the routine that keeps you alert and alive out here. When I caught sight of my own reflection in the rear view, I was smiling. Now, that might not sound strange to you, but I knew for a fact I wasn't smiling. I was tired, focused, maybe a little worried about making my delivery on time, but I certainly wasn't happy enough to be grinning at myself in the mirror. Yet there I was, or rather, there was my face wearing a wide, pleasant smile that looked completely natural and utterly wrong at the same time. I touched my mouth with my free hand, felt the familiar stubble on my chin, the slight downward turn of my lips that comes from concentration. In the mirror, my reflection touched its mouth too, but that smile never wavered. It was like watching someone else wear my face, someone who found something amusing in the dark highway ahead that I couldn't see. The logical part of my mind immediately started making excuses. Trick of the light, maybe. The dashboard illumination hitting the mirror at a strange angle. Fatigue playing games with my perception. I'd heard stories from other drivers about hallucinations brought on by too many hours on the road. Shadows that looked like deer, phantom hitchhikers, voices on empty CB channels. This was probably just another symptom of pushing too hard for too long. I adjusted the mirror, tilted it slightly to change the angle, but my reflection adjusted right along with it, still smiling that eerily content smile. I tried smiling myself, forcing my mouth into an upward curve, and for a moment our expressions matched. But when I let my face relax back into its natural state, the reflection kept right on smiling, as if it had found something wonderful in the darkness behind me. That's when I started to feel the first cold fingers of real unease creeping up my spine. I glanced in my side mirrors, checking the trailer, scanning the empty highway behind me. Nothing but darkness and the faint glow of my taillights painting red streaks on the asphalt. Whatever my reflection was smiling about, it wasn't anything I could see with my own eyes. The next few miles passed in an uncomfortable awareness of that mirror. Every time I looked up, there I was, still grinning like I'd just heard the world's best joke. I tried to ignore it, focused on the road ahead, the gentle curves of the interstate, the occasional overpass with its collection of green signs promising cities and exits still hours away. But that smile seemed to pull at my attention like a magnet, drawing my eyes upward despite my best efforts to keep them on the highway. I reached for my CB radio, thought about calling out to see if any other drivers were in the area, but what would I say? That my reflection was smiling without permission? That I was seeing things in my mirrors that weren't really there? They'd think I was losing it, and maybe I was. Maybe this was how it started. The slow slide into madness that comes from too many years on the road. Too many nights staring into the darkness while the rest of the world sleeps. The highway began to climb into rolling hills, and I downshifted to maintain speed, the engine's deeper rumble vibrating through the cab. In the distance, I could see the scattered lights of a small town, probably not much more than a gas station and a diner, but it represented human contact, other people, witnesses to confirm that I wasn't completely losing my grip on reality. That's when I noticed that my reflection had started to move differently. It was subtle at first, just a slight delay between my movements and its response. When I lifted my hand to scratch my beard, the reflection lifted its hand a fraction of a second later. When I turned my head to check the side mirror, my reflection turned too, but not quite in sync, like a badly dubbed movie where the audio doesn't quite match the actor's lips. The delay grew longer as the miles passed. I would look up at the mirror and see myself from several seconds ago, still wearing that inexplicable smile, moving through actions I'd already completed. It was like watching instant replay footage, except the footage was happening in real time in my rearview mirror, and the person in the replay seemed far happier about our situation than I was. I pulled off at the next exit, desperate for the reassurance of fluorescent lights and other human beings. The truck stop was one of those classic roadside oases, a bright island of civilization surrounded by an ocean of dark farmland. As I backed into a parking space between two other semis, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, watching my reflection navigate the same backing maneuver with that persistent smile, several seconds behind my actual movements. Inside the truck stop, the harsh lighting and the smell of fried food and coffee felt like a return to normalcy. The clerk behind the counter was a tired-looking woman in her 50s, and she nodded at me with the practiced friendliness of someone who'd seen thousands of truckers come and go. I bought another coffee and a sandwich I didn't really want. just to have an excuse to talk to another human being, to confirm that I still existed in the same reality as everyone else. Back in the cab, I sat for a moment before starting the engine, gathering my courage to look in the rearview mirror. When I finally did, my reflection waved at me, not the automatic wave back that a mirror should show, but an independent greeting, as if it was happy to see me return. Its mouth was moving too, like it was trying to tell me something, though I couldn't hear any sound. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, and that's when things got really strange. My reflection began to show me scenes that weren't happening. In the mirror, I could see myself laughing, slapping the steering wheel with apparent delight, gesturing at something outside the passenger window. But in reality, I was gripping the wheel with white knuckles, my mouth dry as cotton, my eyes darting between the road and the impossible images in the rearview mirror. The reflection showed me pulling over at scenic overlooks that didn't exist on this stretch of highway, getting out of the cab and stretching in bright sunlight when the actual world around me was wrapped in pre-dawn darkness. It showed me having animated conversations on the CB radio, while my actual radio sat silent. Most disturbing of all, it showed me looking genuinely happy, more content and at peace than I'd felt in years of driving these lonely highways. As dawn began to creep across the horizon, painting the sky in soft pastels, I realized that my reflection was showing me a different life, not just a different version of this trip, but a completely different existence where driving long haul was pure joy instead of grinding work, where the solitude was peaceful rather than isolating, where every mile brought new wonders instead of simply bringing me closer to the next delivery deadline. The reflection me had pulled over and was walking through a field of wildflowers that definitely didn't exist. Alongside Interstate 40, he was picking a bouquet, still smiling that radiant smile, apparently planning to give the flowers to someone who mattered to him. Meanwhile, the real me was fighting to keep my eyes open, counting mile markers and calculating how much further I could drive before I'd be legally required to rest. That's when I understood what was happening, and the realization filled me with a fear deeper than any I'd ever experienced on the road. The mirror wasn't showing me hallucinations or tricks of light. It was showing me the life I could be living, the happiness that was possible if I just let go of this reality and stepped into that other world, the world where Marcus the trucker was genuinely content with his choices and found joy in the simple act of moving through the landscape. My reflection had stopped moving entirely now. In the mirror, I could see that other Marcus standing in that field of flowers looking directly back at me. The Suspended Storm. From Marcus Chen. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 hours when I first noticed something wasn't quite right. I was hauling a load of electronic components from Denver to Salt Lake City, my 18-wheeler cutting through the darkness of Interstate 80 somewhere in the middle of Wyoming. The wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm, clearing the windshield every few seconds with that familiar squeak that had become as much a part of my nighttime driving soundtrack as the low rumble of the diesel engine beneath me. I'd been driving long haul for nearly 15 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of weather the roads could throw at me. Blizzards that turned the world into a white void, thunderstorms that lit up the sky like God's own light show, fog so thick you could barely see your own hood ornament. But this rain felt different somehow, heavier than usual, each drop hitting the windshield with an oddly metallic ping that seemed to resonate through the cab. The weather report on the CB had mentioned a cold front moving in from the north, temperatures dropping fast, but the dispatcher hadn't said anything about freezing rain. Still, I could feel the change in the air, that particular bite that comes just before everything turns to ice. I'd need to be careful about black ice on the asphalt. Maybe pull over at the next truck stop if conditions got too dangerous. That's when I saw the first droplet suspended in my headlight beam. At first, I thought it was just an optical illusion, a trick of tired eyes and shifting shadows. The droplet hung there in the cone of light like a tiny crystal bead, perfectly motionless while hundreds of others continued their normal descent around it. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand, but when I looked again, it was still there, frozen in midair about 10 feet ahead of my bumper. Then I saw another one. And another. More and more raindrops began to stop their fall, hanging in the darkness like invisible strings held them suspended. They caught the light from my headlamps, creating an increasingly dense field of glittering points that stretched across the highway in front of me. The normal rain continued to fall around them, creating this bizarre mixture of motion and stillness that made my depth perception go haywire. I eased off the accelerator, bringing the big rig down from 60 to 40, then 30 miles per hour. The suspended droplets were multiplying rapidly now, creating what looked like a three-dimensional constellation hovering over the roadway. Some hung at eye level, others floated higher up, and a few seemed to be suspended just inches above the asphalt itself. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was some kind of atmospheric phenomenon I'd never encountered before, perhaps related to the temperature differential the weather service had mentioned, or maybe I was more tired than I thought, hallucinating after too many hours behind the wheel. I'd heard stories from other drivers about seeing things that weren't there during those long, monotonous stretches through empty country, but the droplets looked so real, so perfectly formed and detailed in my headlight beams. I could see their spherical shape, the way they refracted the light, even tiny imperfections and irregularities in their surface. If this was a hallucination, it was the most convincing one I'd ever experienced. I reached for the CB radio, thinking maybe other drivers had noticed the same thing, but when I keyed the microphone, all I got was static. Not the usual background chatter of truckers sharing road conditions and weather updates. Just an empty hiss that seemed to echo the sound of rain on my roof. The suspended droplets were getting denser now, forming what looked almost like a curtain across the highway. I slowed down even further, my speed dropping to barely 20 miles per hour as I tried to navigate through what was becoming an increasingly surreal obstacle course. The frozen raindrops didn't seem to have any physical substance when my truck passed through them, but I could swear I felt a subtle change in air pressure, a slight resistance that made the engine work just a little harder. That's when I noticed the silence. The rain hitting my windshield had stopped, though the wipers continued their rhythmic sweep across dry glass. The steady drumming on the roof of my cab faded away, replaced by an eerie quiet that seemed to amplify every small sound inside the truck. The hum of the air conditioning, the subtle vibration of the steering wheel in my hands, even the sound of my own breathing became unnaturally loud in the sudden absence of precipitation. But the rain was still there, all around me, frozen in the act of falling. Thousands, maybe millions of droplets hung suspended in the air, creating a crystalline maze that stretched as far as I could see in every direction. The headlights revealed layer upon layer of motionless water, each droplet catching and reflecting the light until the whole scene sparkled like the inside of a snow globe. I tried the radio again, cycling through channels, but found only that same empty static. The GPS on my dashboard flickered and went dark, then came back online showing a blank screen with no roads, no landmarks, just a blinking cursor surrounded by empty gray space. Even my phone had no signal, though I was only a few miles from a stretch of highway where I'd had full bars just an hour earlier. The temperature gauge on my dashboard still read normal, but I could feel cold seeping into the cab despite the heater running full blast. My breath began to fog slightly, and I noticed frost starting to form around the edges of the windows. Whatever was causing the rain to freeze in midair was apparently affecting the temperature inside my truck as well. I pressed on, maintaining my crawling pace through the suspended storm, hoping to find the far edge of whatever phenomenon I'd stumbled into. But as the minutes stretched by, the frozen rainfall only seemed to get denser. The droplets began clustering together in some places, forming larger masses that looked almost like ice sculptures hanging in the darkness. In other spots, they arranged themselves in strange geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if my eyes couldn't quite process the angles and dimensions involved. Then I saw the other truck, It appeared gradually through the maze of suspended water, its outline wavering and distorted like something seen through heavy glass. At first I thought it was another 18-wheeler heading toward me in the opposite lane, but as I got closer I realized it was facing the same direction I was, completely motionless in the middle of the highway. The truck looked older than mine, maybe from the 70s or 80s, with a long hood and classic lines that reminded me of the rigs my father used to drive. But something was wrong with it. The paint seemed faded and weathered far beyond what years of road wear should have caused, and I could see rust eating through the metal in places that should have been protected by the cab's design. As I drew alongside it, slowing to a near crawl, I tried to peer into the driver's side window. The glass was fogged over, but I could make out the silhouette of someone sitting behind the wheel, perfectly still. Hands positioned at 10 and 2 o'clock as if they were actively driving, despite their complete lack of movement. I rolled down my window, the sudden rush of cold air making me gasp, and called out to the other driver. My voice seemed muffled and distant in the strange atmosphere, as if the suspended rain was absorbing the sound before it could travel more than a few feet. The figure in the other truck didn't respond, didn't even turn their head in my direction. That's when I noticed that the frozen raindrops around the other truck weren't just suspended in midair like the ones I'd been driving through. They were actually touching the vehicle's surface, coating it in a shell of ice that made the whole rig look like it had been dipped in liquid crystal. The droplets had accumulated in impossible thickness, creating deposits that should have caused the truck to collapse under their weight. But somehow the vehicle remained upright and intact. I realized with growing horror that the truck wasn't just stopped in the storm. It was trapped in it, encased in layer upon layer of frozen precipitation that had built up over what might have been hours, days, or even longer. The driver inside wasn't ignoring me. They couldn't respond because they were imprisoned in a shell of ice as solid and permanent as amber. I gunned the diesel engine, suddenly desperate to get away from the motionless truck and whatever force had trapped it there. But as my speed increased, I noticed that the frozen raindrops around my own vehicle were beginning to behave differently. Instead of simply hanging in space as I passed through them, they were starting to cling to my windshield, my mirrors, the edges of my hood. The wipers struggled against an increasing accumulation of ice, their movement becoming sluggish and labored. The cold inside the cab was getting worse, and I could see my breath now in thick white puffs that seemed to linger longer than they should before dissipating. Frost was spreading across the inside of my windows, and I had to keep wiping the windshield with my sleeve to maintain any kind of visibility through the glass. The language of the lost. From Marcus Chen. The trailer lights on my Kenworth had been acting up for 3 days straight when I first noticed they weren't just flickering randomly. I'd been hauling electronics from Sacramento to Denver, the same route I'd driven maybe 200 times in my 15 years behind the wheel. But this trip felt different from the moment I'd hooked up that particular trailer. The lights would pulse in strange patterns, sometimes rapid bursts like Morse code, other times slow and rhythmic like a heartbeat. At first I figured it was just another electrical gremlin, the kind that haunts every trucker's nightmares and empties wallets at repair shops. The evening air carried that peculiar stillness you only find in the high desert, where the vastness swallows sound and leaves you alone with the steady drone of your diesel engine. I was somewhere between Battle Mountain and Winnemucca on Interstate 80, watching the sun paint the Nevada landscape in shades of amber and rust. My CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter, but mostly it was just me and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the darkening horizon. The trailer lights caught my attention in the side mirror again, pulsing in that odd rhythm that had become almost hypnotic over the past few days. That's when I started paying closer attention, really watching the pattern instead of just dismissing it as faulty wiring. The lights would flicker 3 times quickly, pause, then 5 slow pulses, another pause, then a rapid series of maybe 8 or 9 flashes. At first it seemed random, but as the miles rolled by and darkness settled over the desert, I began to notice the pattern repeating. 3 quick, 5 slow, 8 or 9 rapid, over and over. like someone was trying to communicate something urgent. I'd heard stories from other drivers about strange things happening on long hauls, tales shared in truck stops over coffee and pie about mysterious lights and unexplained sounds. Most of us took those stories with a grain of salt, figuring they were just the products of too many hours on the road and too little sleep. But sitting there in my cab, watching those trailer lights flash their peculiar message in my mirrors, I started to wonder if maybe some of those stories weren't as far-fetched as I'd always assumed. The radio static seemed to pulse in time with the lights, creating an eerie symphony of electronic whispers and crackling interference. I tried switching channels, looking for some human contact, maybe another driver who could tell me I was just imagining things. But every frequency I found was either silent or filled with that strange rhythmic static that seemed to echo the pattern of the trailer lights. The desert around me felt emptier than usual, as if even the jackrabbits and coyotes had found somewhere else to be. As full darkness settled over the landscape, the lights seemed to grow brighter, more insistent. I pulled into a rest area just outside of Winnemucca, figuring I'd check the trailer connections, maybe find a loose wire or corroded contact that could explain the whole thing. The parking area was empty except for a single sedan at the far end, and the overhead lights cast long shadows that seemed to move and shift every time the trailer lights pulsed. The silence was profound, broken only by the ticking of my cooling engine and the distant whisper of wind through the sagebrush. I grabbed my flashlight and walked around to the back of the trailer, but what I found there made my blood run cold. The light assemblies were completely dark, no flickering, no pulsing, nothing at all. Yet when I looked back toward my cab, I could see in the chrome bumper's reflection that the lights were still flashing their mysterious pattern. Somehow the lights I was seeing in my mirrors weren't coming from the actual trailer lights at all. They were reflections of something else entirely, something I couldn't identify or locate. The desert air suddenly felt colder, and I noticed that the silence had deepened to an almost oppressive degree. Even the distant traffic noise from the interstate had faded to nothing, as if the world beyond this rest area had simply ceased to exist. I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal. Not even the single bar I usually manage to get out here in the middle of nowhere. The screen flickered once, displaying what looked like random numbers and symbols before going completely black. Standing there in the parking lot, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, I finally understood that the flashing pattern wasn't random at all. It was a message, and somehow I was beginning to comprehend what it meant. The 3 quick flashes followed by 5 slow ones. Then the rapid series at the end. It was almost like a mathematical sequence, a code that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to something deeper in the human mind. The knowledge came to me gradually, like remembering a half-forgotten dream, and what I understood filled me with a growing sense of dread. The lights were coordinates, not of places but of moments, specific points in time and space where something had gone terribly wrong. Each pulse represented a truck that had vanished along this stretch of highway, drivers who had simply disappeared without explanation, their rigs found empty and abandoned or never found at all. The pattern was a roll call of the lost, a desperate attempt by something or someone to catalog the missing, to ensure they weren't completely forgotten. I climbed back into my cab with shaking hands, suddenly desperate to get away from that rest area and its oppressive silence. But as I started the engine and pulled back onto the interstate, the lights continued their relentless signaling, and now I could see other reflections in my mirrors that didn't correspond to anything visible on the road. Phantom headlights that appeared and disappeared. The ghostly outlines of trucks that weren't really there. Shadows that moved independently of any light source I could identify. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life, but instead of normal trucker chatter, I heard voices speaking in that same mathematical language the lights had been flashing. Numbers and sequences that somehow conveyed meaning beyond words. Communications from drivers who were no longer driving on roads that still appeared on any map. They were trying to warn me, I realized, trying to tell me about the trap that had caught them and was now closing around me. My speedometer began fluctuating wildly, showing speeds that were impossible for my loaded truck, while my GPS display cycled through coordinates that placed me simultaneously in Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and nowhere at all. The landscape outside my windows remained the familiar high desert, but it felt wrong somehow, as if it were a projection or memory rather than actual terrain. The mile markers I passed showed numbers that increased and decreased without pattern, and the exit signs displayed names of towns that existed only in the spaces between reality and nightmare. The trailer lights pulsed faster now, almost frantically, and in their reflection, I began to see images that couldn't be there. Faces pressed against glass, hands reaching toward freedom they would never grasp, eyes that held the desperate knowledge of those who had discovered too late that some roads lead to destinations that aren't marked on any earthly map. The mathematical language of the lights became a symphony of loss, each pulse a life that had been absorbed into whatever force prowled these highways seeking new additions to its collection. I pressed harder on the accelerator, trying to outrun whatever was pursuing me, but the engine responded sluggishly, as if the truck itself was being held back by invisible hands. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the beam seemed to penetrate only a short distance before being swallowed by a darkness that was more than mere absence of light. It was actively dark, aggressively empty, a void that consumed illumination and hope with equal hunger. Then, just as I was certain I was about to join the roll call of the vanished, I saw real lights ahead, a truck stop, blazing with genuine electric illumination, its neon signs and diesel island floods cutting through the supernatural darkness like a lighthouse beacon. I aimed my rig toward that salvation, feeling the strange forces that had been holding me back gradually release their grip as I approached. The realm of electric light and human presence, pulled into the truck stop with my heart pounding and my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. The trailer lights had returned to normal, just plain red running lights with no mysterious flickering or otherworldly messages. Other drivers moved about the fuel islands and parking areas, solid and real and wonderfully ordinary. The CB radio picked up normal chatter about weather and road conditions and the eternal complaints about fuel prices and delivery schedules. But as I walked into the truck stop restaurant, seeking the comfort of coffee and human conversation, I overheard two drivers talking at the counter about strange lights they'd been seeing in their mirrors. One of them, a weathered veteran with 30 years of highway experience, was describing a mathematical pattern of flashes that sounded all too familiar. 3 quick, 5 slow, then a rapid series at the end. He said it had started just after he'd picked up a load in Sacramento, bound for Denver. I left my coffee untouched and walked quickly back to my truck, suddenly understanding that my escape hadn't been an escape at all, but rather a temporary reprieve. The trailer lights began their mysterious pulsing again as I climbed into my cab, and I realized that the mathematical language they spoke now included my own story. The passenger I never picked up, from Dale Morrison. The rain had been hammering my Kenworth's windshield for the better part of 300 miles, turning Interstate 80 through Nebraska into a river of reflected brake lights and the occasional lonely beam of oncoming headlights. I'd been driving this route for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture across the heartland, and I knew every truck stop, every rest area, every place where the highway curved just enough to catch you off guard if you weren't paying attention. Tonight felt different, though, in that peculiar way that settles into your bones when the weather turns nasty and the radio starts picking up nothing but static between the distant AM stations that fade in and out like ghosts whispering secrets you're not meant to hear. My CB had gone quiet hours ago, which wasn't unusual this deep into the night shift, but the silence felt heavier than normal, pressing against the cab like something with weight and intention. The only sounds were the steady thrum of the diesel engine beneath me, the rhythmic sweep of the wipers across the windshield, and the occasional ping of rain against the chrome exhaust stacks rising behind my sleeper berth. I'd upgraded the sound system in the cab just last month, installing new speakers throughout, including a pair of premium units in the rear that could shake the whole truck when I cranked up the classic rock stations during the long hauls across the plains. Tonight, though, I kept the volume low, letting the music drift through the cab like background conversation in a nearly empty diner. The truck stop in Grand Island was still 2 hours ahead when I first heard it. So faint I almost convinced myself it was just interference bleeding through from some distant radio tower, or maybe the rain playing tricks with the sound waves bouncing around inside the cab. It came through the rear speakers, just a whisper really, like someone sitting in the sleeper berth behind me was trying to get my attention without startling me awake from a dream. The thing was, I knew for certain that no one else was in the truck. Hadn't been since I'd left the depot in Chicago 3 days earlier with a load of appliances bound for Sacramento. I reached over and turned down the radio, letting Creedence Clearwater Revival fade to nothing, and listened to the rain and the engine and the sound of my own breathing in the sudden quiet. For several minutes there was nothing unusual, just the ordinary symphony of a long-haul truck cutting through the Nebraska night, and I began to think my imagination was getting the better of me the way it sometimes did during these marathon runs when exhaustion started creeping in around. The edges of your vision and every shadow seemed to move with purpose. I turned the radio back up and tried to focus on the road ahead, on the hypnotic dance of the wipers and the way the yellow center line disappeared and reappeared in the spray, kicked up by the occasional car that passed me heading the other direction. But then it came again, clearer this time, definitely coming from the rear speakers. A voice that sounded almost familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have heard it before. The voice was asking about the weather, wondering if the rain was going to let up before morning. And there was something about the casual way the question was posed that made my skin crawl, because it sounded exactly like the kind of small talk you'd make with a passenger you just picked up. Someone settling in for a long ride and trying to break the comfortable silence that sometimes develops between strangers sharing a confined space. I reached over and shut off the radio completely, yanking the knob hard enough that it clicked with finality, but the voice continued, as if the music had never been playing at all, commenting now on how dark the highway was out here away from the cities, how easy it would be to get lost if you didn't know where you were going. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I glanced in the mirror at the sleeper berth behind me, seeing nothing but the familiar chaos of my personal belongings and the rumpled blankets where I'd tried to catch a few hours of sleep at the last truck stop. The voice kept talking, rambling now about other trucks it had ridden in, other drivers who had been kind enough to share their cabs during long journeys across the country, and there was something in the tone that suggested gratitude mixed with a deeper longing, as if the speaker was remembering better times that could never quite be recaptured. I wanted to respond, to demand an explanation for what was happening, but my throat felt dry and constricted, and besides, there was no one there to answer even if I could find the words. The miles rolled by beneath my wheels as the voice continued its one-sided conversation, sometimes commenting on landmarks I couldn't see in the darkness, sometimes sharing stories about other drivers and their rigs, tales that had the worn, comfortable feel of memories that had been polished smooth by countless retellings. There was mention of a driver named Rex, who had hauled cattle through Montana in the 70s, and another called Moondog who had run cigarettes up from North Carolina before the taxes made it unprofitable. And gradually I began to realize that the voice was describing people and events from decades past, painting pictures of a trucking world that existed long before I'd ever climbed behind the wheel of my first rig. As we passed the exit for Kearney, the voice shifted tone, becoming more personal, asking about my family, wondering if I missed them during these long hauls, expressing sympathy for the loneliness that comes with spending weeks away from home, sleeping in the cab of a truck while the world rolls by outside your windows. The questions were gentle, understanding, spoken by someone who clearly knew the life, who had experienced the peculiar isolation that comes with being always in motion, but never quite arriving anywhere that feels like home. Despite my growing unease, I found myself wanting to answer, to share the small details of my life with this invisible companion, who seemed to genuinely care about my experiences. But when I opened my mouth to speak, the voice interrupted as if it had heard my thoughts, telling me not to worry about responding, explaining that it understood the difficulty of the situation, the natural fear that comes with encountering something that doesn't quite fit into the normal patterns of experience. The voice assured me that it meant no harm, that it was simply grateful for the company, for another chance to ride along on one of these cross-country journeys that had once been such an important part of its existence. There was sadness in those words, a deep melancholy that seemed to fill the cab like smoke, and I found myself feeling sorry for whatever presence was sharing my truck. The rain began to ease as we approached Grand Island, and the voice grew quieter, more distant, as if the clearing weather was somehow diminishing its ability to communicate. It thanked me for the ride, for not trying to silence the radio or pull over to investigate, for simply accepting its presence and allowing it to experience once more the simple pleasure of watching the highway unroll in the glow of the headlights. There was a wistful quality to the farewell, like someone saying goodbye at a train station, knowing that this particular journey was ending, but hoping that perhaps there might be another opportunity someday in the future. As I pulled into the truck stop, the voice faded entirely, leaving only the sound of the engine winding down and the occasional ping of the cooling metal. I sat in the dark cab for several minutes, listening to the rain pattering gently on the roof, wondering if I had imagined the entire experience, if the long hours and the monotonous highway had combined to create an elaborate hallucination. But when I finally climbed down from the cab and walked around to check my load, I noticed something that made my blood run cold in the humid night air. There in the thin layer of dust that had accumulated on the rear of the trailer despite the rain, someone had drawn a smiley face with their finger, the kind of simple, childlike image that truckers sometimes left for each other as a small gesture of camaraderie. But I knew for certain that the drawing hadn't been there when I'd stopped to fuel up 6 hours earlier, and there was no way anyone could have reached the back of the trailer while I was driving. The face looked fresh, the lines clear and deliberate in the dust, and below it, someone had written, "Thanks for the ride, Dale," in letters that seemed to glow in the amber light from the truck stop's security lamps. I climbed back into the cab and started the engine, pulling out of the truck stop and back onto the highway with a strange mixture of fear and anticipation churning in my stomach. The rear speakers remained silent as I drove through the rest of the night, but I found myself glancing frequently in the mirror, half hoping and half dreading to hear that gentle voice again, to have another conversation with my mysterious passenger. The rain had stopped completely by the time I reached Colorado, but I kept the radio turned off, listening instead to the sounds of the truck and the road and the vast empty spaces that stretched out on either side of the highway, wondering what other travelers might be sharing the journey without my knowledge, and whether I would ever again hear that voice drifting through the speakers, like a memory of all the roads I had traveled and all the miles yet to come. The Hill That Drinks the Sky, from Marcus Webb. The first thing you learn as a long-haul trucker is that roads have personalities, and some of them are downright mean. I've been driving these highways for 23 years, hauling everything from furniture to frozen goods across this great country, and I thought I'd seen every kind of road there was. The gentle rollers through Pennsylvania farmland that rock you to sleep if you're not careful, the treacherous mountain passes in Colorado where your engine screams and your brakes smoke, the endless hypnotic stretches of Texas blacktop that can make a man question his own sanity after 12 hours behind the wheel. But I'd never encountered anything like State Route 847 in northern Nevada until that October night, when my GPS decided to take me on what it called a faster route to Reno. My rig was a 2018 Peterbilt 579 with a sleeper cab, painted deep blue like the ocean at twilight, and she was loaded down with 26 pallets of canned goods bound for a grocery chain. The weight sat heavy behind me, exactly where it should be, distributed properly across the trailer's axles just like I'd done thousands of times before. The night was crisp and clear, with that desert cold that seeps through your jacket and settles in your bones once the sun disappears. My headlights carved twin tunnels through the darkness ahead, illuminating sagebrush and the occasional reflective eyes of some nocturnal creature. The engine purred with that steady, reliable rumble that becomes the soundtrack to a trucker's life. A mechanical lullaby that had carried me safely across millions of miles. I'd been driving for about 6 hours when the GPS directed me to take exit 23 onto Route 847. The off-ramp curved away from the interstate and climbed gradually into what looked like empty desert hills. Nothing unusual there. Nevada has more empty space than most people see in a lifetime. The road was well maintained, recently paved from the look of it, with fresh yellow lines that glowed bright in my headlights. A green sign confirmed I was heading in the right direction. Route 847 north, Reno 89 miles. For the first 10 minutes, everything felt normal. The road wound through low hills covered in scrub brush, climbing steadily but not steeply enough to strain the engine. My CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, and the familiar weight of the trailer pulled steadily behind me. The speedometer held steady at 65 and my fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. Just another stretch of Nevada highway on another routine run. That's when I noticed the first anomaly. A small pebble on my dashboard. Nothing more than a piece of gravel that must have gotten kicked up somehow and found its way into the cab through an open window earlier in the day. It was sitting near the base of my windshield, and as I watched, it began to slide, not toward the passenger side as it should have, given that the road was curving left, but toward the driver's side instead, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving in the wrong direction. I figured it was just my imagination, or maybe the curvature of the dashboard was playing tricks on my eyes. But then I noticed my coffee cup in the holder beside my seat. The dark liquid inside was tilted at an angle that didn't match the road. The surface of the coffee was slanted as if I were taking a hard right turn, even though I was driving straight up what appeared to be a gentle grade. The engine's rhythm remained steady, but something felt different in the way the truck was responding. Normally, on an uphill climb like this, I'd feel the weight of the trailer pulling back against me. That familiar tug that makes you downshift and give it more throttle. Instead, the truck felt almost eager to climb, as if something were pushing us forward rather than gravity pulling us back. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable once I noticed it. I glanced at my mirrors and saw something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The trailer behind me appeared to be leaning, tilted at an angle that should have been impossible. Not swaying side to side like trailers do in strong crosswinds, but canted over as if the whole rig were parked on the side of a steep hill. Yet the road ahead looked perfectly normal, just a straight climb through the desert darkness. The pebble on my dashboard had now slid all the way to the left side and was pressing against the window trim. My coffee cup's surface showed the liquid at such a steep angle that it should have been spilling over the rim, but somehow it wasn't. It was as if gravity itself had shifted, pointing not down toward the earth but off at some impossible angle that my senses couldn't quite process. I tried the radio, thinking I might reach another driver who could confirm what I was seeing, but the CB was silent except for static. Even the distant chatter from the interstate had faded away. The only sounds were my engine's steady rumble and the whisper of tires on asphalt. Outside my windows, the desert landscape looked normal enough, but there was something unsettling about the way my headlights threw shadows. They seemed to fall uphill, painting dark patches where there should have been light and leaving bright spots in hollows that should have been black. The grade ahead appeared to steepen, though my engine wasn't working any harder. If anything, the truck seemed to be accelerating slightly, as if we were going downhill instead of up. I pressed gently on the brakes just to test the response and felt the familiar pressure and resistance. The truck slowed normally, but that strange sensation of wrongness persisted. Every instinct developed over 2 decades of driving was telling me that something fundamental was not right about this road. A new sound reached my ears then, faint but distinct beneath the engine noise. It was a creaking like old wood under stress coming from somewhere behind me. I checked my mirrors again and saw that the trailer was definitely tilted now, leaning so far to one side that the wheels on one side should have been lifted off the pavement. but I could still feel all the tires gripping the road, still sense the familiar weight distribution that told me everything was properly connected and balanced. The creaking grew louder, and now it was joined by another sound, a deep groaning that seemed to come from the road itself. Not the usual expansion joint noises or the whisper of wind through rock formations, but something deeper and more disturbing. It reminded me of the sounds a house makes when it's settling, but amplified and stretched out like a recording played at the wrong speed. My fuel gauge caught my attention next. It was reading fuller than it had been 20 minutes ago, which was impossible. I'd been driving steadily uphill with a heavy load. The needle should have been dropping, not climbing, yet there it was, hovering closer to the full mark than when I'd started up this strange road. Even the engine temperature was running cooler than normal, despite what should have been the increased strain of the climb. The headlights illuminated a sign ahead. Route 847, elevation 6,200 feet. I knew I'd started this climb at about 4,000 feet, which meant I'd gained over 2,000 feet of elevation in the past 30 minutes. That should have been a serious climb. The kind that makes your ears pop and puts real stress on an engine, especially with a full load. But I felt none of that. Instead, the truck handled as if it were rolling along flat ground or even coasting gently downhill. I tried to make sense of what I was experiencing, running through all the possible explanations. Inner ear problems that might affect my sense of balance and orientation, some kind of optical illusion caused by the darkness and the way my headlights hit the terrain, engine problems that might make the truck behave differently than expected. But none of those explanations accounted for the physical evidence I could see and feel. The tilted coffee, the sliding pebble, the impossible trailer angle, the fuel gauge that defied physics. The road ahead curved to the right, and as I followed it around the bend, my headlights swept across something that made my breath catch in my throat. There, perhaps a quarter mile ahead, was another truck. It was climbing the same road I was on, but it was wrong in every possible way. The trailer was tilted at such an extreme angle that it should have jackknifed or rolled over, yet it continued moving forward. The whole rig appeared to be climbing the road sideways, like a vehicle driving up the wall of a building. As I got closer, I could see it was an older Kenworth, probably from the 1990s, painted a faded red that looked black in the darkness except where my headlights hit it. The trailer behind it was a standard box trailer, but it was positioned at what had to be a 60-degree angle from vertical. No load securement system in the world could keep cargo stable in that position. Yet the truck maintained its steady speed and showed no signs of distress. The frequency of fear. From Marcus Delacroix. The first thing you learn as a long-haul trucker is that every load tells a story, but some stories are better left unread. I've been running freight for 23 years. From the fog-wrapped coastlines of Oregon to the sun-bleached highways of Arizona, and I thought I'd seen everything that could fit in the back of an 18-wheeler. That was before I picked up the research equipment in Burlington, Vermont. On a Tuesday night when the October air carried the scent of dying leaves and distant snow. The shipping manifest was sparse, listing only scientific instruments, fragile, temperature-controlled, using with a delivery address in Albuquerque. The client was some university research facility I'd never heard of, but their money was green and the payment was generous enough to make up for the tight delivery schedule. What struck me as odd was the special handling instructions printed in red ink at the bottom of the paperwork, warning me to maintain complete electrical isolation of the cargo bay and to avoid any radio transmissions while the freight was aboard. Loading took place in an unmarked warehouse on the outskirts of town, where men in white lab coats supervised the placement of a single, unremarkable metal container about the size of a large refrigerator. The thing was wrapped in what looked like aluminum foil and surrounded by enough foam padding to cushion a Fabergé egg. They sealed my trailer with special locks that only the receiving party could open, handed me a thermos of coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration, and sent me on my way with nervous smiles and handshakes that lingered just a moment too long. The first 700 miles passed without incident. My Peterbilt 579 hummed along Interstate 89 through the Vermont darkness, her engine purring with the satisfaction of a well-maintained machine. The autumn night was crisp and clear, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt, and the occasional deer caught in my headlights served as the only reminder that I wasn't alone in the world. I'd driven this route dozens of times before, knew every truck stop and way station between here and the Southwest, but something felt different about this trip from the very beginning. It started as I crossed into New York, a subtle vibration that seemed to come not from the road or the engine, but from somewhere behind me in the trailer. At first I dismissed it as the cargo settling, maybe the padding shifting as we took the gentle curves of the interstate, but as the miles rolled by, the vibration grew more pronounced, developing a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a heartbeat. I adjusted my mirrors and checked the trailer lights. Everything appeared normal, but the sensation persisted like an itch I couldn't scratch. Somewhere outside Albany, I noticed my radio had gone quiet. Not just quiet, but completely dead, displaying nothing but static across all frequencies. The GPS unit flickered and reset itself twice before finally giving up entirely, leaving me to navigate by memory and highway signs. My cell phone showed full bars but couldn't maintain a connection. Calls dropping before they could connect and text messages disappearing into the digital void. The electrical isolation the shipping manifest had mentioned wasn't just a precaution. It was apparently a side effect. Dawn found me rolling through Pennsylvania hills shrouded in morning mist. The kind of ethereal fog that makes you question whether you're still on the same planet you started from. That's when I first heard the sound that would haunt me for the remainder of the journey. It began as a low humming, barely audible above the diesel engine's steady rumble, but gradually rose in pitch until it resembled the whine of feedback from a microphone. The sound seemed to emanate from the trailer itself, as if the cargo had awakened and was trying to communicate. I pulled into a truck stop outside Harrisburg, hoping a break would clear my head and maybe provide some insight into what was happening. As I backed into a parking space, I watched in fascination and growing horror, as every piece of glass in the immediate vicinity began to develop hairline cracks. The windows of nearby trucks spiderwebbed in perfect concentric circles. The glass doors of the fuel station developed fractures that spread like frozen lightning, and even the mirrors on my own rig started showing stress patterns that hadn't been there an hour before. The other drivers gathered around my truck with a mixture of curiosity and concern, their voices creating a low murmur of speculation and worry. An older man with a white beard and kind eyes introduced himself as Jimmy from Oklahoma, a veteran hauler with 4 decades of experience who claimed he'd never seen anything like the systematic glass failure surrounding my trailer. He suggested I contact my dispatcher immediately, but when I tried to explain that all my communications equipment had stopped working, he just nodded grimly and wished me luck. Back on the road, the humming sound grew stronger and more complex, developing harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones. Every overpass we passed under, every bridge we crossed left a trail of cracked concrete and shattered safety glass in our wake. I began to understand that whatever I was carrying wasn't just cargo. It was something that operated on frequencies beyond human perception, something that treated the molecular structure of glass like a tuning fork responds to sound waves. The Pennsylvania Turnpike stretched before me like a ribbon of uncertainty, and I found myself driving faster than usual, eager to reach my destination and be rid of this mysterious freight. But speed only seemed to amplify whatever was happening in the trailer, the humming becoming more insistent and the glass damage more widespread. By the time I reached the Ohio border, I was leaving a wake of destruction that would probably make the evening news in every town I passed through. Night fell again as I crossed into Indiana, and that's when things became truly unsettling. The harmonics emanating from my cargo had evolved into something that resembled music. If music could be composed entirely of frequencies designed to induce unease. It was a symphony of sound that existed just at the edge of hearing, notes that seemed to bypass my ears entirely, and vibrate directly in the fluid of my inner ear. I began to experience a disorientation that made it difficult to judge distances and speeds, forcing me to rely more heavily on familiar landmarks and highway markers. The truck stops I encountered showed increasing reluctance to serve me once they witnessed the glass damage that accompanied my arrival. Fuel attendants would hurriedly complete their transactions and retreat to safe distances, while other drivers began giving my rig a wide berth on the highway. I was becoming a rolling disaster zone, a mobile anomaly that transformed ordinary travel into a journey through an increasingly surreal landscape of fractured reflections and shattered transparency. Somewhere in Illinois, I made the mistake of trying to sleep in my cab during a mandatory rest period. The dreams that came were filled with images of vast crystalline structures that sang with voices beyond human comprehension, geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly, and the persistent sensation that I was being observed by intelligences that existed in dimensions perpendicular to our own reality. I woke to find that every piece of glass within 100 yards of my truck had developed the same concentric crack patterns, including the windows of a farmhouse whose occupants were probably wondering if they'd experienced a localized earthquake. The remainder of the journey became a blur of increasingly desperate miles as I pushed westward through Missouri and Kansas, while the mysterious cargo continued its relentless emission of reality-altering frequencies. The music had become more complex, incorporating rhythms and melodies that seemed to reference mathematical constants and physical laws I couldn't begin to understand. It was as if the equipment in my trailer was attempting to decode the fundamental frequencies of existence itself, testing the resonant properties of matter in ways that human science had never contemplated. I reached the delivery address in Albuquerque just as the sun was setting behind the Sandia Mountains, painting the high desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost too beautiful to be real after 36 hours of supernatural strangeness. The research facility was a low, windowless building, surrounded by carefully maintained grounds and security fencing that hummed with its own barely audible energy. As I backed up to the loading dock, I noticed that all the windows in the facility had been replaced with what appeared to be thick sheets of transparent aluminum, a material apparently immune to whatever force had been cracking glass across half the continent. The unloading process was handled by technicians, wearing protective gear that looked more suited to a hazardous materials cleanup than scientific research. They worked quickly and efficiently, their movements coordinated with the precision of a team that had performed this procedure many times before. As they wheeled the container away on a specialized cart, I caught a glimpse of warning symbols I didn't recognize in text in what might have been Russian, or possibly something else entirely. The facility director, a nervous woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to focus on something just beyond my shoulder, handed me an envelope containing my payment, plus a substantial bonus she claimed was for discretionary expenses related to collateral damage. She also gave me a business card with nothing but a phone number printed on it.